Well, let's cross live now to Davos, where the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, the French Economy Minister, Bruno Le Maire, and the European Central Bank President, Christine Lagarde, are all discussing the global economic outlook.
Action needs to be taken to stop that from happening. Bruno Le Maire, the French Finance Minister, thank you so much for being with us. This week, Bruno Le Maire said that tax credits and subsidies could help Europe counter competition from China and the United States, particularly around green technology. Joint debt, I believe he thinks, could be the answer to help meet the challenge of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. But we'll find out a little bit more about that as we go through the panel discussion. Christine Lagarde, stay the course. That has been the message from the ECB this week, and we're very pleased to have Christine with us to tell us a bit more about that and potentially what other challenges are out there for monetary policy in the Eurozone. Haruhiko Kuroda. This morning, the Japanese inflation rate saw 4%. 4%. That is the highest since 1981. It's been quite a week for the Bank of Japan governor, who has been in the midst of a battle with the bond markets over how he's managing yield curve control and monetary policy. And just to let you know, although I'm sure you are very aware, this will be probably his last Outlook panel as the Bank of Japan governor. He leaves that position on April the 8th. Larry Summers. Larry Summers, now in education, of course, but former Treasury Secretary. Larry Summers, I think, is starting to feel that there is a possibility that we might get something that looks a little bit like a soft landing in the United States. He also, I think, has a view on China. It would be a staggering error, I think, Larry, you've said, for the US to try and suppress Chinese growth. So I hope that gives you a little insight on how our key panelists feel about some core issues. Very briefly, as we gather for this first winter Davos in 3 years, there's still a great deal of uncertainty about the economic outlook, as we know. Growth has lost momentum. Inflation is resistantly and persistently high. The cost of living crisis is generating poverty and labor strife. Central banks are tightening financial conditions. Energy prices remain high. Global debt is high and in some places is still rising. And I haven't even talked about Ukraine and the horrible crisis in Ukraine, the humanitarian crisis taking place there, or really the state of the energy transition, which we might also need to get onto here. And so, Kristalina, should our audience be pessimistic or optimistic about the year ahead?
Well, stay put. My message is it is less bad than we feared a couple of months ago. But less bad doesn't quite yet mean good. Let me start from what has improved and why we have to be cautious. What has improved is inflation seems to have started leading in the right direction, in other words, down. Headline inflation in particular. What has improved is the prospect for China to boost growth. Let's remember last year, 22, China registered for the first time in 40 years lower growth rate than the global average. Never happened in 4 decades. Now, with the reopening of China, we expect growth this year to again exceed global average. We project 2.7% for the world. This may be corrected somewhat in a couple of days. For China, we project 4.4%. And what has changed in the positive is that we have seen demonstrably strength of labor markets translating into consumers spending and keeping the economy up. Why we should be cautious? Well, first, 2.7, if this is the growth we achieve, by far is not fabulous. This is the third lowest growth rate in the last decades after the global financial crisis and COVID. It's not great. Second, we don't know quite yet how inflation would march downwards. What if the good news of China growing faster translates into oil and gas prices jumping up, putting pressure on inflation? And three, the horrible war in Ukraine is a risk for primarily the people of Ukraine, but it is also a tremendous risk for confidence, especially in Europe. So, conclusion, be careful not to get on the other side of the spectrum from being too pessimistic to being too optimistic. Stay in the middle of realism that seems to serve the world well. And if I may finish on the issue of fragmentation, we would, if we look at medium-term growth prospects, how we handle security of supply chains would matter tremendously on our future prospects of growth. If we diversify rationally, the cost of this adjustment would be low. We put it down to 0.2% of GDP. If we are like an elephant in a china shop and we trash the trade that has been an engine for growth for so many decades, the cost can go up to 7% loss of GDP, $7 trillion. So a great deal of whether we can lift up optimism depends on the people in this room. Be pragmatic, collaborate, do the right thing, keep the global economy integrated for the benefit of all of us.
We were having, just to give you a little insight into what happens inside the speaker's room ahead of this, there was a relatively healthy discussion going on as to the semantics of when we are not going to downgrade further translates into we may be more optimistic and we may be going to upgrade soon. And I don't think you were tempted onto the turf that Larry Summers was trying to bring you on, which was, at what point do you start thinking at the IMF about upgrading rather than saying we are not downgrading?
Well, we look at the last year, we have downgraded our projections 3 times. So not downgrading is already good news. Whether we would upgrade, and if we do so, how much we will see in 10 days. But I can tell you, it is not going to be a dramatic improvement vis-a-vis what I'm projecting right now, the 2.7%. And let's be very honest. Whether Germany finishes 2023 with minus 0.3%, which was our October projection, or they finish with plus 0.5%, which may be our new, the projection may go up to that level. Still, for hundreds of millions of people in Germany, all over Europe, in the world, when we are at this low level of growth, it would be painful. And let me send the biggest caution I could today. Labor markets are holding firm so far. But interest rates are yet to bite. And if they bite more severely, then we can see unemployment going up. And it is very different for a consumer to have cost of living crisis and a job than to have cost of living crisis and no job. So we have to be thinking of possibly unemployment going up at a time when fiscal space in governments is very tight. There isn't that much they can do to help people, and yet they would be pressed to do it. Christine, then all the power to you. If fiscal policy works against purpose with monetary policy, then you may have to tighten even further.
Larry Summers, I want to talk very quickly about the American economy, given it has been the engine that's picked up as China's been in zero COVID. And we always used to say, you know, America sets the interest rate, China determines the growth rate. But in recent years, that's not been quite so obvious. But undeservedly, I'm sure, you got a reputation for being a bit of an economic grouch, I think, since secular stagnation. And then, of course, last year you were talking a lot about how we're going to have high unemployment and we're heading into recession. But as I read your commentary more recently, it sounds like you might be coming round to the idea that maybe a soft landing could be somewhat achievable. So did Team Transitory get the causes of inflation right? It just got the timing wrong. What do you think?
I don't think Team Transitory got it right. I think there were very substantial excesses of both fiscal and monetary policy which needed to be corrected. Markets assigned a probability of less than 1% to the interest rate increases we've seen over the last year, a year ago, and that was because they underestimated the need for central banks to catch up, which central banks have done. We're experiencing some exhilaration of relief in Davos. Hyperpopulists lost elections and accepted their defeat. Europe has not frozen. Recession has not come. China has adjusted its policies towards the world, and inflation has decelerated. Those are all positive things and reasons why we should feel better than we felt a few months ago. But relief must not become complacency. Inflation is down, but just as transitory factors elevated inflation earlier, transitory factors have contributed to the declines that we have seen in inflation. And as in many journeys, the last part of the journey is often the hardest. And that's true with respect to a return to the inflation target. The greatest tragedy in this moment would be if central banks were to lurch away from a focus on assuring price stability prematurely, and we were to have to fight this battle twice. I've been encouraged by the things that I've heard Madame Lagarde say, that I have heard Chairman Powell say about their determination. I've been encouraged by what I have heard Governor Kuroda say in quite different context. But we have to carry through, because if inflation were to be allowed to surge back, that would put not just price stability, not just standards of living for some of the lowest income people at risk, but also pose very substantial risks to cyclical stability. At the same time, we need to remember, both within our countries and around the world, the importance of those who have been left behind and who are bearing the greatest burden from all of these necessary adjustments. And that, too, is going to be crucial in the years ahead. And I would pick up on something that I think Kristalina said that I think is very important as she warned against fragmentation. And I think Davos is a particularly important place to make the point that I'm about to make. Global integration must never be a primary cause of local disintegration if that global integration is going to continue with all of the benefits that it can bring. That implicates every policy issue, from the treatment of the debts of many countries facing substantial debt overhangs, to the challenges in the smaller cities and rural areas of all our industrial countries, if people are to feel part of a successful community. I believe there's great positive potential in this moment. I've been doing this for many years, and there has never been a moment where I have been so impressed by the potential of technology, whether it is green technology, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and information technology, to make things better for all the world's people. But that will only happen with the right kind of political and financial foundation.
Well, since you've said that, let me go to this straight away, because I know at least Bruno Le Maire will have a view on this. It was said on our set, I think in one of the interviews, if we're going to have a trade war over anything, let's have a trade war over green transition technology. Because if it's going to stimulate the brightest and the best in a race for new technology that helps the transition, then that's not a bad thing. But nobody actually wants a trade war. How do we get through this row going on between Europe and the United States over the Inflation Reduction Act?
Well, I would respectfully, I would distinguish between a subsidy war and a trade war. A subsidy war about very good things is basically a good thing. Walling off each other's innovation is basically a much more problematic thing. And so, yes, I would like to keep markets open, and I think that is hugely important. I think in its totality, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States is a historically positive measure. In its detail, I think there are certainly, and I would be in the direction of Bruno, problematic aspects. But look, if we are all competing over who can accelerate a transition towards renewables more rapidly, who can be the biggest leader in storage and transmission technologies, that is a very healthy kinds of competition relative to all the kinds of competition the world has seen. So yes, let's compete on that, but let's compete by how hard we try and how much we subsidize, not by how we wall off others or try to take down others. We need to win in a positive some way by building ourselves up rather than by seeking to tear others down. And if we can do that, I do think there's enormous potential in this moment.
We'll cycle back to this in just a moment, Minister, if you don't mind, because I think perhaps the one huge macro story of last year that we need to also talk about here is the reopening of China. So I'd like to bring that into the discussion, and we'll come back to the issue of IRA in just a moment. And Christine Lagarde, if I might bring you in on this, because, look, I know you are determined to tackle inflation in Europe. This week, you have again stressed your desire to do that. But can I ask you, how does the reopening of the Chinese economy at this stage complicate the ECB's analysis of the inflationary headwinds that may emerge? Are you modeling for this already? And if so, what are you coming up with in terms of conclusions about whether there may be a secondary impulse from China's reopening on the inflation front, and how that may extend how long you need to keep rates rising?
Thank you so much, and good morning to all of you. I would like to first of all make a small observations. The situation around the world must be improving a little bit if you hear so many competent, talented economists say, not as bad as feared, or not so bad, maybe not yet good, but improvement. Added to which, our economies and key players are moving from defense mode, which they had been collectively sometimes in 21 and certainly in 22, to competition mode, as Larry indicated. So something must be getting better, and certainly better than what we feared initially. 22 was just a weird year when you look at it. Inelasticity of supply, no real big engine for growth. If you look at the GDP numbers, it's totally, counterintuitive. Growth in the United States, 1.9%. Growth in China, 3.3%. Growth in Europe, 3.4%. Those are not usual numbers. This is not the normal ranking that you have. So we are now heading to a year where hopefully the corporates, the consumers, the state, policymakers will continue to have that resilient, determined approach in order to engineer the transitions that must take place, whether it's digital, whether it is green, whether it is inclusive, in order to make sure that the most fragile countries in the world benefit from those innovations, as Larry referred to. But we have to also stay that course of resilience that we observed in 22. So stay the course is my mantra for monetary policy purposes, no question about that. But I think other players must also do the same thing. And they must do it in probably a more subtle way than they had in 22. The fiscal support that was expanded in 22, for instance, must be better directed, better targeted, must be made such that it is not going to push the monetary policy actors to having to do a bit more, as Kristalina earlier on alluded to. So, in all that, China is waking up again. After, assessed to be 3.3% growth, it is now forecasting 5.5% growth, and we should welcome the auspices of those commitments. And it is a case that the COVID policy or the change of this COVID policy will kill a lot of people, but will also revive the economy, and that's clearly a determined choice that was made by the Chinese authorities. What impact it will have on all of us in terms of added demand addressed to the global economy is something that will be a positive for China, most likely, will be a positive for the rest of the world, but will have inflationary pressure on many of us, simply because the level of energy that was consumed by China last year was certainly less than what they will consume this year. The amount of LNG that they will be buying from the rest of the world will be higher than what we have seen. And there is not so much spare capacity in terms of both oil and gas, so that we will have complete elasticity in there. So there will be constraints, there will be more inflationary pressure coming out of that added demand in commodities and energy in particular. And yes, we do try to model all that. I think that the economist profession has been put under huge pressure, whichever team they belong to. because there are lots of things that models try to do, but modeling uncertainty and taking into account certain factors that have simply never happened in the poly-crisis environment that we faced was tough. I think our honor is to acknowledge that and to try to do a better job in the future.
Just refocusing back in Europe, is there a chance that euro-dollar back at 120 could persuade some members of the Governing Council perhaps to temper their rate outlook or adjust their rate outlook?
I didn't see 120 this morning.
Oh no, we're not there yet. But I mean, the trend, if the trend is really your friend, then maybe we are going to see a stronger euro, which would ease some of the inflationary pressure, perhaps.
That's an economic mechanical impact that we all know about. The central bank does not target an exchange rate, and obviously we take into account in our measurements and in the impact that it has on inflation, the variation of currencies.
Well, it was worth a try.
That was a perfect politically correct answer.
Kuroda-san, let me be very blunt here, as the bond market has been very blunt with you, I think, since December. Was it a mistake to widen the trading band in your yield curve control program? And what have you learned from the market reaction?
I don't think the decision taken by the board last month was not wrong, perfectly right, and we will continue the current extremely accommodative expansionary monetary policy in order to achieve 2% inflation target in a sustainable and stable manner. But let me point out a few things. First, the Japanese economy is recovering from the pandemic, and probably in fiscal 2022, the Japanese economy has grown by about 2%. And for fiscal 2023, again, the economy is likely to grow close to 2%. Since Japan's potential growth rate is about 1% or less than 1%, 2 consecutive years of 2% or close to 2% growth, well above potential growth rate, mean that the GDP gap is closing and the labor market has becoming tight, and we expect wages to accelerate to grow, and that would eventually make 2% inflation target met with sustainable and stable manner. But second point, as you said, the inflation rate in last December reached 4%, highest in the last 40 years, but largely caused by import price hike. And we expect probably from February this year, inflation rates start to decline, and fiscal year 2023 as a whole, inflation rate would be less than 2%. So we decided to maintain the current extremely accommodative monetary policy for the time being. Our hope is that wages start to rise, and that could make 2% inflation target to be met in a stable and sustainable manner, but we have to wait for some time. Third point, as prior speakers argued, certainly digital transformation and green transformation, these two aspects of structural changes would hopefully raise potential growth rate in coming years while achieving necessary socially responsible attitude toward climate change risk. And already the Japanese government indicated that the government would facilitate providing substantial subsidies as well as tax breaks to increase digital investment, including investment in human capital, and also decarbonization investment. Actually, the government estimates that even in Japan alone, such green transformation investment would amount to more than $1 trillion in the next 10 years, which is huge. And that would require, of course, scientific as well as various progress. But I'm quite sure that in these two aspects, the Japanese economy can grow, hopefully with 1 to 2% in the next couple of years.
As you leave your post, I guess it will be custom. I don't know whether it's custom in Japan, but it's custom in many offices in Europe that you leave a letter for the next person who takes the job.
You're watching a global economic outlook session coming to you live from the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. It's a veritable who's who of the world of economics and finance. You've got IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva up there on stage, along with French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire, the ECB President Christine Lagarde, the former US Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, and of course the Governor of the Bank of Japan, Kuroda Haruhiko. Well, for more on this ongoing panel, let's cross live now to London and speak to Arise business analyst Bode Oshosami. Bode, inflation is possibly the biggest single topic discussed in that panel. We're hearing mixed signals, though. Perhaps China's reopening is going to exacerbate inflation. Perhaps we're at a turning point. What's your assessment of the situation?
Well, I think the context differs in different geographies, and I think that came across when you see the different voices airing their perspectives. Obviously, Kristalina, she continues to harp on cautious optimism. If you watched our year-end on Arise, that was also what our prognosis of what we're likely to see in 2023 is. That is a much better situation with inflation going down, but not down fast enough, and there could also be some surprise reversals along the way. So it's cautious optimism. But you also have to pay attention to what Larry Summers says when he adds that some of the issues that we said were temporal when inflation was going up, we could also have temporal issues, transitory issues bringing inflation down. What that means is that inflation, some of the factors like oil prices and prices, for example, could take another turn, and we could see inflation also going in another direction. But I think the big good news certainly is China's reopening. China, just like we heard, tends to be the growth engine, while the US tends to be the monetary engine, if you can understand the difference. And if China doesn't do the lifting as far as growth is concerned, we would have an adverse impact, I would say, globally. So it's important, even though, yes, I think there is going to be an expansionary implication for coming out of China's growth, but clearly the optimism that we're seeing now is coming mainly from China's reopening. Hopefully it would be successful, and of course the issues also around the data that we've actually started seeing, which shows that most of the numbers are actually looking much better than expected, especially towards the end of 2023. So I think by and large it's a good picture. It's getting better. Lagarde, I like how she also put it, instead of fighting and going into hiding, we are now competing, which I think is a slightly nuanced way of describing the progress. Yes, we're not going to have competition over subsidies, which is what we used to have before, but we are not having trade barriers, trade walls, and countries closing up as we had when we were in defense mode in 2022. So it's a mixed picture, and that's how it really has to be, because the world is a mixed place.